Mandalorian Twilight =RK=. Part 4, Eclipse. CIC, Republic Cruiser Chimera. High orbit above Mandalore. Gilad Palion was in his domain. The CIC was a hive of activity as commando units augmenting the Mandalorian authorities raided Death Watch criminal enterprises all over the world below them. The operation was coordinated from the Chimera, with the Embassy and the Security Service HQ in Sundari acting as secondary CNC centers. While he had people to do the actual coordination, both intel operatives and GAR officers from the ground ponder contingent upon his ships, the Commodore kept a close eye on the situation, though most of his attention was concentrated on the enemy Navy elements in system. So far neither the CIS battle group or the small Death Watch flotilla had made any suspicious move, and they both kept their positions, above Concordia and between the moon and the planet itself. Frankly, Palion didn't really expect much problems from them, especially when the September Command Dreadnought left a few days ago, when it was recalled along with the enemy commander. Or at least that's what the intel folks figured out. It was another confirmation about the apparent upheaval among the enemy leaderships, something that was hopefully a good thing. Any delay between now and the next major CIS offensive meant less time before the next major flight of ships was completed in the various Republic shipyards, less time before the enemy would lose the temporary advantage they would be gaining shortly. The Commodore returned his attention to the datapad he had in hand and skimmed the reports in it. They more or less summarized the strategic situation. In short, in the last few months GAR had performed excellently, gaining 2 major strategic victories, which in turn allowed both the Navy and ground ponders to stabilize their positions across the galaxy. Frankly, those victories were vital, because the situation was going to get worse before it improved. It was all about economy and logistics, something that when combined with the enemy strategic surprise at the start of the war was going to bite everyone in the Republic on the ass. When all was said and done, while the Republic had large air economy, it meant little until it was transferred to a footing. That was the short-term case anyway. After all, it took at least a year to complete a proper capital ship. Usually a year and a half, perhaps even 2 years for most cruisers. And that was without any bottlenecks in either resource appropriation, component manufacture and their related the enemy on a war footing when the hostilities started. It was a miracle that the Separatists simply didn't overwhelm the Republic in the first months by going after the major political and industrial centers. Even now, a little more than a year after the conflict began, the situation was grim. The GAR scored some outstanding victories that shifted the initiative and strategic situation. Unfortunately, despite that, the economic realities were about to rear their ugly heads, and soon. Simply put, most capital ships that the CIS laid when the conflict began would be ready before the same was true about the Republic. That would very soon give them a strategic advantage and allow them to regain the initiative by launching one or more major offensives, heavily reinforce various theaters where both sides were stalemated too. It would be one of the best chances the enemy would have in winning the war, if they could cause enough damage before the Republic's own construction came online. What rubbed Gilad and most GAR commanders wrong was the fact that after the victory at Geonosis, they simply lacked the assets to launch another major offensive before the enemy was ready. Oh, he knew that there were at least a few large raiding forces doing their best to wreak havoc on the enemy logistics combined with the efforts of various special forces units inserted behind enemy lines. Yet, the CIS did respond in kind, and he doubted that any side would be gaining much advantage that way. No, the Republic armed forces were in for a few very interesting months. The only silver lining was that if they could hold the line and avoid suffering catastrophic losses, soon enough the advantage would shift in their favor. Then again, what was that saying? If wishes were speeders. Or was it starfighters? Gilad shrugged and marked the overall strategic overview as read. There was nothing new in there, which at least meant no bad news. Next he checked the situation on the ground again. Everything was going more or less according to plan, though there were some locations where resistance was heavier than expected and things were getting bloody. Unfortunately, most of the troubles were in places where orbital support was impractical, and for the moment sending regular troops was out of the question. The current intervention was explosive enough without sending the cavalry. Ironically, this was the night the general was getting married for the local ruler's sister, and if the scuttlebutt was correct, General Kenobi was doing the same with the Duchess herself. That at least more or less guaranteed that Mandalore was for some fun times in the next few days. There were few things screaming political alliance more loudly than marriages after all. In fact, The ongoing dual weddings were the primary reason why Palion's squadron was on high alert with Vale's surprises on standby. No one really believed that the Death Watch would go quietly in the night. The only question was what exactly were they going to do to ruin everyone's day. There was a long list of contingencies prepared for precisely that outcome. Multiple new contacts. 4 light seconds out, between us and the hostile one. The sensor operator shouted. Identify. Palion snapped an order without thinking and turned around to look at the main tactical plot. Griff. He added a moment later, once the large cluster of grey dots registered. Multiple power spikes. We're being targeted. Profiles match SIS units. Multiple munificents and command dreadnoughts. Evasive maneuvers. Launch all small craft. Target the closest munificents for missile strikes. Calms contingency purple. Release Guardian in automatic mode. We're being jammed. Long-range comms are out. The comm operator stated a moment later. Purple 1. Execute. The Commodore added after a split-second delay. Contact our hosts and coordinate with them. We'll need their help. He knew that within moments one of the escorting frigates was going to go into hyperspace and call the cavalry. Then all 9 Corellian hells were going to get loose. The plot shifted. The grey icons turned into bright red color. 2 small windows appeared next to the swarm indicating force composition. 100 munificents and counting plus at least 4 command dreadnoughts. It was a full separatist fleet all right. Probably part of their strategic reserve if not most of it. Acting this bold probably meant that the Confederates would be ready to jump back on the offensive a bit sooner than the intel types expected. Not good at all. But all Palion was really interested in right now was keeping his forces more or less intact until Vale's ace in the hole arrived. The plot blinked as a real swarm of angry red dots left the enemy fleet and headed toward his battle group. We're in contact with TF-1. The comm operator announced. That was the closest Mandalorian cruiser group, 4 Keldrable Flight 1 cruisers and 12 Crusader-class corvettes. The other friendly group on this side of the planet, TF-2 made of 5 more cruisers and 10 escorts, was right above the capital of Sundari, which almost below them due to the planetary rotation. It would be an effective weapons range of the enemy within the hour, if the newcomers didn't shift position. Realistically, just a few minutes if they could take out the friendly forces in the area. TF-1 will be taking position between us and the capital. They report no contact with the Royal Palace. Try to raise Generals Vale or Kenobi. No joy. We're detecting groundside jamming from the palace area. Deploy QRF to Sundari. There to secure the generals. Shift orbit and bring us above the capital. Coordinate our movements with the Mandalorians. Status change. Hostile 1 and the DW squadron are moving. Calculating heading. As this was going on, Palion's eyes never left the plot. 163 munificents and 5 command cruisers. TF-1 actual is in contact with TF-3. They will be executing 2 hyperspace jumps and hit the enemy from behind. TF-3 was the third and final loyalist part of the Mandalorian defense fleet. 4 more cruisers and 11 corvettes. On paper that combined with the defense satellites should have been enough. The Keldrables were supposed to be formidable ships. And the planned Block 2 upgrade would make them at least equal to a Venator. There even were whispers among the intel agents on board that Mandal Motors had plans for a Block 3 that would be a partial rebuild with enough firepower and defenses to rival the Star Destroyer prototypes Kuat was currently playing with. Unfortunately, the current iteration of the Keldrable cruisers was simply put an inferior piece of hardware, primarily because the Mandalorian defense fleet never received the funding to bring them up to spec. =RK=. Part 5, Twilight. Bridge. SIS Command Ship Deathbringer. Between Mandalore and Concordia. General Grievous narrowed his eyes at the tactical display once it refreshed with the data from the sensors. 3 clusters of closely knit icons appeared near each other designating the expected enemy forces, no surprises there. For once the intel appeared to be correct. There had to be another group of the Mandalorian fleet on the other side of the planet, but they weren't of immediate concern. If everything was going according to plan, Death Watch operatives and SIS agents on the ground should be assaulting the capital's shield generators while others went after the planetary shield itself. Even if they were unsuccessful, the mere threat would force the enemy fleet assets to converge above Sundari in order to protect the domed city. Primary target is the Republic Task Force. Battle Groups 1 through 3 chose a Venator and take it out. 4 and 5, concentrate on the Mandalorian loyalists. Task Force 73 is to take out the defense satellites and commence orbital bombardment on all pre-designated targets. Grievous shot out a rapid sequence of orders. Launch all fighter craft. 60% are to engage Republic and Mandalorian small craft. 20 are to remain as cap. The rest will escort the troop transports once the defense satellites are taken out. A veritable swarm of vulture droids exploded from the hulls and hangars of the Separatists' fleet. For a few seconds it appeared that Grievous' command suddenly combusted and blew away in a storm of high-velocity debris. If he could, the Cis general would have smiled at the sight, though he lost that ability when he was captured by the never-sufficiently damned Jedi and Republic soldiers. He was going to see them all die screaming for what they did to him, and he was going to start with Mandalore. Even better, this time there were just a handful of Republic capital ships. Even their vaunted Guardian system wouldn't be enough to stop all the vultures he had to throw around. For the first time in months the damned pieces of junk might actually prove useful as something more than target practice. Someone call our allies' ships and order them to engage the Republic scum. Grievous added as an afterthought as his eyes ran over the icons representing the small Death Watch battle group. Had the fleet advanced towards the gap between the Republic units and the Loyalists above the capital? Ahead third. That should have the enemy moving in the right direction, or they would risk letting his forces in bombardment range of the capital. Incidentally, if they moved to intercept his fleet, Grievous would have them where he wanted them, in position to be overwhelmed by his superior numbers and firepower. The general didn't pay much attention as small dots representing concussion missiles separated from the Republic cruisers, nor did he particularly care that they were launching their small craft complement while doing their best to evade his long-range fire. It didn't really matter. The distance was shrinking by the second and the enemy couldn't afford to decline battle. That left them with the option to stand and die, something Grievous was more than willing to accommodate. It was just too bad that most of them wouldn't live long enough to see him burn Mandalore. Speaking about the planets, there were icons rising from the surface, squadrons of the Mandalorian vaunted fighter/transport hybrids. Some had the Death Watch IFF, though most were the Security Forces QRF squadrons. A glance revealed that the enemy fighters wouldn't make orbit before TF-73 blew up the satellites in range and opened up on them while the small craft were busy clawing their way out of the atmosphere. The conclusion was foregone. Most wouldn't make it and the survivors would have to contend with overwhelming number of vultures. Grievous dismissed that distraction out of his mind and concentrated on the more dangerous enemy. Just a few seconds later, one of the Republic frigates vanished. For an instant, the general thought that a lucky shot got it, but he immediately dismissed that idea. His whole fleet was concentrating their fire on the enemy cruisers. The jamming produced by his ships ever since exiting hyperspace. The Republic commander undoubtedly sent for help. Unfortunately for the bastard, Intel was sure that the Closet Republic reinforcements were at least a couple of hours away, and even those were just a handful of Venators with a light escort. Not enough to change the tide here. TF-73 is commencing bombardment on designated targets. One of the B-1 droids crewing the bridge announced. That particularly message got Grievous' attention and his eyes shifted towards a side screen near his seat. He pressed a few buttons and his eyes started drinking the sensor feed from TF-73. Another button press later and the image shifted to that of a camera showing the bombardment in all its glory. Mandalorian security spaceports, airfields and the few dedicated military bases in range simply ceased to exist under barrages of railgun projectiles and turbo laser fire. The best were the targets near or within populated areas. Seeing them burn made Grievous feel a bit better, even if all that was merely a taste of things to come. Most importantly, the successful first strikes demonstrated that the planetary shield was down. With a bit of luck it would stay down for a few more minutes and then his fleet would be in weapons range of the shield generators themselves. Soon enough Sundari was going to burn and Veil with it. =RK= Force composition above Mandalore. Republic Battle Group / Commodore Gilad Palian commanding / 5 Venators, 15 CR-90 frigates. Mandalorian loyalists. TF-1, 4 Keldable cruisers, 12 Crusader corvettes. TF-2, 5 Keldable cruisers, 10 Crusader corvettes. TF-3, 4 Keldable cruisers, 11 Crusader corvettes. Total, 19 cruisers, 15 frigates, 33 corvettes. Death Watch Squadron, 3 Keldable cruisers, 15 Crusader corvettes. CIS forces. Hostile 1/TF-71, 1 Command frigate, 12 Munificent frigates. Grievous Fleet/General Grievous Commanding/ 5 Command dreadnoughts, 163 Munificent frigates. Total, 5 CD, 3 cruisers, 1 Command frigate, 175 Munificent frigates. Remember Mandalore. =RK equals. Part 1. Bridge. MDF Cruiser Conqueror. High orbit above Concordia. Senior Captain Arif N. was the man in command over the detachment from the Mandalorian Defense Fleet under Death Watch control. In fact, he was instrumental in persuading the crews of the ship in his battle group to shift allegiance from the weak new Mandalorian government to the only people who could restore the pride and glory of their people. It took all Ven's charisma, everything he had learned in his 40 years as a warrior, to persuade his men and women to follow him in what some would call treason. It was his conviction that the Death Watch would bring a future worth fighting for that finally turned the tide. Captain Ven used to be quite proud of his achievement. For 2 weeks or so, the Death Watch was in a 3-way negotiation with Satine Kryze's people and the Confederacy, which as far as he knew were going quite well. Then the rumored Sith, who had been making a name for himself in the last few months by handing the Sith their collective heads, decide to come negotiate. On the Republic side. That's when everything started going terribly wrong for the Death Watch, and Arif began having treacherous second thoughts. There were certain things that were simply not done, like trying to assassinate someone who was having a drink in a bar instead of facing them in honorable combat. At least the end of that debacle, which was caught by multiple cameras, proved beyond a doubt that the new Republic general was actually a Sith and not one of those Jedi peace-loving fools. Things continued to go downhill, with Satine and company suddenly becoming somewhat competent, and anyone with 2 working brain cells to rub together knew who was to blame. And finally, it was tonight's event, Vale, the Sith, marrying one of the more famous Death Watch members, with all that entailed, mind you, after facing the woman in a duel that showcased both their skills. In just a week or so, the Death Watch had fallen from an almost guaranteed shoo-in as the new government to being viewed as a bloody thugs who had no real respect for the traditions that made someone a Mandalorian. It all made Ven question his choices in life. All he wanted was for his people to stop being gutless wonders and earn back their pride and restore their way of life. Was it too much to ask? == So it comes to this. Commodore Ven snarled. The Mandalorian was standing in front of the tactical display, close enough that its holographic light made him appear as a ghost standing in the center of the bridge. Sensors, I want to know what those fools are doing. Navigation, bring us after them, Arif snapped, pointing at the string of icons representing the original Sith delegation. Those ships were burning straight towards Mandalore, while the Confederacy fleet that just arrived was already heading towards the Loyalists' battle group protecting the capital. Sir, we're being ordered to assist Task Force 71 with neutralizing any planet-side resistance. The comm operator spat. General Grievous claims control of all Sith and allied forces in system. Arif didn't need to look at the young lieutenant to know that the man was beyond furious by those orders. Do we have any word from Vizsla or Death Watch Command? The captain asked. Just requests for our bases on Concordia to know what the criff is happening up here. Navigation. Plot mere hyperjump right behind the Sith ships heading for Mandalore. We'll intercept them as they engage the orbital defenses. Ven ordered. Weapons, I want targeting solution on that command frigate the moment we revert to real space. He didn't really need to think about it. When all was said and done, he knew his duty as a Mandalorian warrior. Criff the Confederacy and Vizsla too, if the bastard believed it to be acceptable to let the tin cans pacify his home. For a moment the bridge crew simply stared at their commander. The man that persuaded them to join Death Watch and by extension ally with the Confederacy had suddenly gone 180 degrees on all he had been preaching for months. What are you waiting for? Ven snapped. Supposed allies or not, I'm not letting those machine bombard Mandalore. You have your orders. Move it, people. The captain's voice echoed over the bridge. That broke the spell and everyone snapped out of their short-lived shock, then started executing their orders. Contact the Blade Runner and Warlord. All cruiser are to take out the command frigate. Gunship squadrons are to concentrate on a munificent each. Once we engage the enemy, Contact whoever is in charge planetside and inform them that we'll be available to provide limited orbital support for the next few minutes. Ven continued snapping orders. Our reef size never left the tactical display. He knew that no matter what he did right now it would be too late. He had priffed up already, all his prepare contingencies, all the pre-calculated jump points were aimed against the Republic battle group and the Loyalists. Ven should have done the same for his supposed allies. If he did, his task force would have been able to jump them before they entered orbit and started bombarding the planet. As things stood, he would be a minute or two too late, and that could be a long time when someone was about to bombard your home. RK equals CIC, Republic Cruiser Chimera. Low orbit above Mandalore. Avenger is to pull back behind us. Weapons, shift fire to hostile 4. Don't bother destroying the enemy, shift targets once they're damaged enough to fall out of formation. Palion ordered. His whole ship shuddered and shook as another well-aimed salvo went home. Shields down to 50%. We have bleed through over the armor. Guardian system is down to 80%. The commander overseeing damage control announced a moment later. Enemy fighters are breaking through. There's just too many of them. That was the Guardian operator. TF-1 just lost a second cruiser. We're down another frigate too. Tactical added to the bad news. That left a single operation Keldable in that battle group. Purchasing stripped-out versions of the capital ships was biting the Mandalorians on the ass, though that wasn't of any real comfort for the Republic officer. The only silver lining on the whole criffed-up situation was that the Death Watch squadron had switched sides moments after the Sis started bombarding Mandalore. A minute later, the last Mandalorian battle group finally came from behind the Confederacy fleet and struck them in the rear, putting them between two forces. That in fact was the only reason why Palion and the Loyalists were still alive. Whoever was in charge on the Sis side was reasonably competent and went with a simple but brutally effective target, simply hit the enemy like a speeding freighter and overwhelm them. Under different circumstances that tactic would have backfired. Palion and the Mandalorians would have attempted to take apart the bigger Confederate fleet with hit-and-run strikes and might have very well won. However, somehow the enemy had succeeded in sabotaging not only the planetary shield, but the Theater 1 protecting the capital. Worse, the smaller, yet potent defense field that should have kept the royal palace intact was down too, thus pinning the defenders in place. Vultures are swarming the resourceful. Captain K requests immediate assistance. Shift as much Guardian fire as possible in their direction. Do we have any available fighters? Palion asked. Negative. The CAG answered immediately. All fighters and bombers are engaged. The Commodore stared at the plot. The escorts in range of the resourceful were doing their best, pouring laser fire and missiles at the robot fighters taking apart the Venator. Yet the Vultures didn't care and continued to gut the cruiser while disregarding the incoming fire. A few dots designating a Mandalorian fighter squadron broke from their station around one of the Keldables and pounced the swarm with suicidal determination. They managed to take out at least a wing of the machines before being erased from existence by the enemy. The Chimera shook again, even more violently than before. Shields down to 35%. We lost a tuber laser bank. Guardian down to 65%. Palion glanced to the left, where a small hologram gave him an overview of his command. The Avenger was hiding behind the Chimera with her shields down. The resourceful had lost at least half its weapons and an engine, and the rest would follow soon. The Mandalorians were down to half their number, with most of the rest being damaged. The only reason Palion's capital ships were in as good a shape as they were was that the Sis commander had shifted targeting priorities after the Death Watch squadron switched sides. Gilad doubted that he would still be around if the enemy had continued to concentrate all its firepower on his cruisers as it was the case in the start of the engagement. Hold position. Sensors, have you identified the enemy flagship? Palion asked. It's either CD1 or 3. We'll have it nailed in a few. All capital ships, switch fire to CD1. Palion ordered, throwing the dice. He simply didn't have any more time. In just a handful of minutes, his ships might be unable to take out an enemy dreadnought before the ship pulled back and munificence moved in to block the firing lanes. If Gilad had guessed right, if his ships could kill or at least cripple the target, then they might buy a few more minutes. Yet, it wasn't like being lucky would change the outcome. The enemy was down about a third of its original size and all dreadnoughts were so far intact. The same couldn't be said for the defenders. Palion glanced at the time. It was too soon. He knew Vale had reinforcements, though they weren't too close by necessity. All nearby systems in deep space were monitored by both sides to avoid someone pre-staging units for a surprise attack. Unfortunately, that didn't stop one side or the other from making a long-range jump, and the ships slotted for purple contingency were at least 5 minutes away. The Commodore grimaced. Even if the reinforcements arrived this minute, they might be too late to prevent the Sis from bombarding Sundari as they did with a lot of other cities and towns in range of their guns. The casualties groundside were already in the double digits millions and raising by the minute. The next strike made the whole Chimera shake like a small fish boat during a storm. Shields are down to 20%. We have breaches in decks. The enemy formation was shifting, and that made Palion tune out the DC report. CD-1 was falling back under emergency thrusters, while at least 20 frigates were hurrying to build a physical barrier between it and the defenders. That was going to disrupt their carefully laid salvos and buy a bit of time. The Resourceful is down. It lost both weapons and propulsion. Enemy fighters are targeting the Avenger. Palion could see it clearly, yet he couldn't do a thing. Every anti-fighter weapon in range was busy gunning down the vultures, yet there were too damn many of them. "Sir, 2CD and their escorts are targeting us," the sensor operator shouted in distress, his composure breaking. "All hands abandon ship. I repeat, all hands abandon ship. Set up weapons at automatic fire and navigation to ram the closest CD, then get your asses out of here," Palion ordered. With the shields in tatters, the Chimera wouldn't survive more than a minute or two of concentrated fire. At best. At least some of the crew might make it to the pods before his ship went down in flames. Remember Mandalore? =RK=. Part 2. Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Hyperspace. When on the bridge of her ship, Commodore Joanna Holt often felt like a queen of old. As a commander of the Freedom, she had more power at her fingertips than most people could imagine and less could comprehend. Her so-called Corellian cruiser was kilometers-long behemoth shaped like a dagger, which had enough firepower to shatter continents and boil oceans. Her command had defenses to rival her offensive power, both shields and meters-thick armor belt among other things. The Freedom had a respectable sublight acceleration too, however if there was one area where Holt's baby was lacking it was her hyperdrive. First, it took a lot of fuel to propel something of that mass with any speed through hyperspace. Second, due to the Republic's laws, both range and speed for ships of this caliber were heavily regulated. Even if in practice Freedom and her sisters were a bit faster and longer-legged than was strictly legal. All of that meant one thing: when the Commodore got the call that Mandalore was under heavy Confederate attack, she was some time away even at best speed. It took Holt mere moments to read through Palion's message, see what the enemy had brought to the table and make a decision. Simply detaching her faster escorts was out of the question. They wouldn't arrive fast enough to make enough of a difference. Not after everything her command had been through ever since the battle for Geonosis. For weeks Holt's battle group had been raiding Sis positions, forward bases, mining operations, and even a few small shipyards met their end under the guns of the Freedom and her escorts. While the huge Corellian cruiser braved through everything the enemy had to throw at her and emerged intact, the same couldn't be said about her escorts. Corvettes, frigates and even Venottas were damaged or even destroyed on a dozen battlefields, even if the enemy had to pay with multiple shattered ships for every Republic unit they took out. After everything was said and done, the Freedom and her remaining escorts broke contact and made their way within range of Mandalore, though sneaking through the void between the stars in order to make it undetected wasn't exactly fun. Still, they made it even if the closest reasonably safe waiting position was farther than anyone would have liked. Holt's battle group executed 2 jumps, a short one that placed them straight in the middle of the hyperlane leading from the core of Republic space towards Mandalore, and the second, that led towards the battle for the heart of Mandalorian space. For 20 minutes Joanna kept a calm exterior, while her command flew at best speed through hyperspace. Her Freedom, 5 lightly damaged Venottas, 10 light cruisers and 14 frigates and corvettes, augmented by the battle group's depleted small craft complement and the Guardian system that turned out to operate better than even its creators believed in their wildest dreams. Joanna hoped that it would be enough to turn the tide, because she knew that every minute it took her ships to reach Mandalore meant less of the defenders would be still alive. Real space reversal in 30 seconds. Freedom's navigator announced. This is it, people. Look alive. Primary targets are Confed command ships. Fire plan lander, shoot the munificents until they're disabled, we'll mop up later. I want all small craft launched the moment we're out of hyperspace. The Commodore ordered. She looked over the bridge, where every station was manned by experienced officers in the orange and black uniform of the Corellian Defense Force. A small, pride-filled smile appeared on Joanna's face. Just a few months ago, she and her people were inexperienced spacers who didn't really know what real war meant. All their training, war games and anti-piracy operations meant nothing when compared with the hell that was Geonosis. For Holt and her fellow Corellians, that first battle was a crucible that forged them. It proved to the galaxy as a whole and more importantly to themselves that Corellia was still a power not to be taken lightly. Then she led a campaign that put small but not insignificant dent in CIS operations across 2 whole sectors, and now, when she was heartbeats from joining another major battle, Joanna felt only pride. Real space reversal in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The nav officer counted down aloud. The familiar image of hyperspace was replaced by serrated ranks of munificents as Holt's ships appeared above Sundari. While the Commodore had feared that she might place her ships out of position relative to the enemy by going straight for the capital, that turned out to be unfound. In fact, one of the first things she saw was a munificent shattering by the armored prow of the Freedom, which simply ran the frigate over while slowing down from hyperspace transition. All stations, fire at will. Joanna gave the redundant order for the record. She knew her people were already acquiring targets and would be shooting in seconds. Calms, raise whoever's in charge and give me a sit rep. Tactical, what can you tell me? At that moment, the Freedom opened fire. Dozens of turbo laser emplacements spat emerald death at the heart of the CIS formation. Concussion missiles and proton torpedoes detached from their launch tubes seeking their designated targets. The closest munificents died before their droid crews could react in any meaningful way. Their shields and armor were woefully lacking when set against even a fraction of Freedom's arsenal. Within seconds a semi-sphere of shattered hulks surrounded the Corellian cruisers as she simply smashed aside the enemy frigates. Then her escorts joined the fun, though all their significant firepower appeared woefully lacking in comparison. However, the CIS units that found themselves under onslaught by the lighter Republic ships would disagree, if they lived much longer, that is. We've acquired the closest CIS command ship. Firing now. The commander overseeing all of Freedom's weapons announced. In less than a minute, the Corellian behemoth had carved a way through the enemy fleet and simply shattered everything between it and the closest CIS dreadnought. Freedom's main batteries stopped firing for a handful of seconds as they retargeted and then unleashed more than enough firepower to kill a continent on a 2-kilometer-long Providence. The dreadnought's shields popped up like a soap bubble, followed by the armor that boiled for a moment before vaporizing. A heartbeat later the whole ship shattered before its reactor added its fury to the colossal energies killing the Providence. Then the dreadnought simply vanished in an expanding cloud of molten metal and high-velocity debris. Well done. Find me the next Providence and kill it. Are there any friendlies still alive? Holt asked as her battle group continued to cut the enemy fleet in two. We've got at least one active Venator the Avenger, and couple of Mandalorian cruisers on the other side of the enemy fleet. A single capital ships plus a few escorts is on our right flank engaging the CIS. We're still trying to burn through enemy jamming. Permission to dump some of the reserve energy into Eastman Calms? Granted. Burnt through the interference. Locate primary CIS ECM platforms and silence them. What's Mandalore's status? We're detecting signs of orbital bombardment but nothing conclusive, ma'am. Working on it. Tactical, shift our escorts to the right flank. Once we've cut the enemy fleet in two, we'll take on the left group and the rest of the battle group will handle the other half. =RK=. Part 3. Bridge. CIS command ship Deathbringer. High orbit above Mandalore. Fury. That was the only thing General Grievous could feel. He had practically won. Only a fraction of the enemy fleet was still operational and they were going to die shortly, when those damned Republic reinforcements showed. Not just a standard Venator battle group or a usual Republic fleet, that wouldn't have enraged him so. Oh, no. The never-sufficiently cursed enemy had to send a Criffing Corellian cruiser, A ship built from the ground up to face and kill whole fleets. Those kinds of units didn't simply appear from nowhere. There weren't many of them in the whole galaxy, and any intelligence service worth their salt kept a track on their general location at the very least. An 8 kilometers long cruiser didn't just drop from nowhere in your moment of triumph. Not when intelligence all but guaranteed that there were no significant Republic forces close to Mandalore. Grievous balefully glared at the center of the bridge, where a tactical display hovered above a holotank. 2 minutes and already almost half of his remaining fleet had been gutted, including 2 of the dreadnoughts, which apparently deserved special attention from the Criffing Corellians. The Cis commander did what he could, tried to reorient his fleet so their main guns could shoot at the newcomers, but it was simply useless. He didn't need to look at the sensor feed to see that the firepower his ships could bring to bear on the so-called cruiser simply wasn't enough to break through its shields. The Munificents simply died before they could put a second salvo in an enemy that had been designed and built to absorb such punishment and ignore it. All units are to cover us. Get us on escape vector and in hyperspace as soon as possible. Any ship that can, start shooting at Sundari too. I want that city reduced. Grievous snarled. Despite his blinding rage, despite his need to see Mandalore burning, he already knew the outcome of this battle. With his fleet caught so out of position, even attempting to ram the cruiser wouldn't work. His ships would be reduced to flotsam before they could gain enough speed to be of any real threat to the enemy. Hells, the Corellians wouldn't even notice if they ran over a Munificent or 2. Grievous was pretty sure that they did it just after arriving. The general slammed an armored fist into the closest console, demolishing a comm unit. He had to get out of here. Survive so he could rain his vengeance upon both the Republic and the Confederacy that so obviously betrayed him. The Deathbringer spun under emergency thrust and headed away from the huge Corellian behemoth. Fortunately, that ship decided to take on half the surviving fleet alone while its escorts dealt with the rest. That was the first good news for Grievous since everything went to hell. Now he had more than an even chance of leaving this cursed system in one piece. He watched with satisfaction as ranks of Munificents placed themselves between the Gar reinforcements and his command ships. The frigates were dying under the concentrated fire of 5 Vinotters and their escorts, but not fast enough. The navigational computer was already calculating an escape vector, and all Grievous needed was a clear lane and a minute or 2 at worst. Oh. One of the useless B-1s manning the bridge moaned. Grievous' eyes snapped from the tactical display and looked through the windows. =RK=, bridge. MDF cruiser Conqueror. High orbit above Mandalore. An enemy command ship is making a run for it. The tactical officer shouted. A turbolaser salvo slammed again into the side of the Keldable and dug deep into the abused armor belt. The sheer energy transfer made the whole ship shake as if a giant had picked it up and tried to pry everything loose. Yet, the Conqueror survived and continued to fight even if half her weapons were little more than burned-out pieces of twisted metal. No, they aren't, Ven snapped. Put us in front of them. I don't want the bastards jumping away. The under-equipped battleship changed vectors and accelerated as her engines went to full military thrust. Her remaining weapons spat defiance and scored another kill as a Munificent broke under her barrage. 3 Cis frigates changed course in an attempt to block the Conqueror and unleashed their arsenals upon the unshielded cruiser. Armor buckled, ablated and shattered, opening multiple decks to space. Ven could see unlucky crew being sucked into the void, with the more fortunate dying as they hit debris. Targets changing course. We may not be able to block it. Conqueror's pilot reported. Ven looked at the plot. It was going to be very close, at best. He glared at the icon of the Cis dreadnought making a break for hyperspace. The enemy commander, the same one who ordered Mandalore bombarded, might very well be on that ship. The captain smiled. That bastard wasn't going away. Override reactor and engine safeties. Ramming speed. It was a testament to his crew's dedication and discipline that no one flinched or asked for clarification. Aye, sir. Ramming speed. The pilot answered with grim determination. A few seconds later, Conqueror buckled onto their feet as the engines went beyond their safe limits and the acceleration pushed close to what the inertial dampeners could compensate for. If the latter failed, everyone on board would be transformed into a fine paste under a few hundred gravities of acceleration. On the other hand, very soon it wasn't going to matter. Ven stopped looking at the tactical display and stared through the windows of the bridge. He could actually see the dot that was the enemy dreadnought getting larger and larger. All non-essential personnel have permission to abandon ship, the captain announced, though he doubted that many of those who could would run for the escape pods. They all made a choice, because of him, that shredded any honor they ever had. For Ven and many Mandalorians, joining Death Watch had been the only viable way they saw in order to preserve their traditions. He and many of his colleagues in the MDF saw that the new Mandalorians weren't really interested in restoring Mandalore as it should have been. Instead, Satine and her government did their best to strangle the core of their culture, of what meant to be a Mandalorian. Mandalorians weren't a single race or even a species, it was an idea, a culture and a way of life. A bitter chuckle escaped Ven's lips. All he had done for years was aimed at a single goal, to make his mother, the woman who took him after he was orphaned at shortly before the beginning of the Mandalorian Civil War, proud. Instead, Ven's actions made him and all who followed him traitors. They were supposed to protect Mandalore, not ally themselves with those who would see their home burn. There was only one way out of this dishonor. The Cis dreadnought was growing larger and larger. In moments, it would be all that could be seen from the bridge. The closest enemy frigates poured everything they had in stopping the Conqueror. The Keldable was little more than a wreck by this point, yet its engines were still alive and the bridge intact. A Munificent tried to physically intercept the Mandalorian ship, yet before it could reach it, the frigate died a fiery death under the guns of a Venator, which immediately targeted another enemy that was trying to stop them. May and Death our honor be restored, Ven whispered. =RK=, Bridge. Cis command ship Deathbringer. High orbit above Mandalore. Damn you all, Grievous roared. The last remaining Mandalorian ship in this part of the battlefield, once supposed to belong to his allies no less, was doing its best to stop the general's flight. A whole division of Republic light cruisers jumped behind the Keldable and opened fire, doing their best to cut off Grievous' escape route. The remaining GAR units were burning through the Munificents trying to protect Deathbringer, and bomber squadrons were unleashing hell upon any Cis unit they could reach. As if to prove him right, the deck below Grievous' feet shook. Multiple hits. We're under attack by enemy bombers. The hyperdrive is out. A dispassionate tactical droid announced. Damnation. The general roared again and ran towards the nearest escape pods. He used his claimed lightsabers to carve through the bridge's armored door when it didn't open fast enough, smashed an unlucky B-1 and even cut into a super battle droid that was between him and the way to relatively safety. Grievous jumped into the first escape pod he saw and slammed his fist on the release button. A door slid shut behind him and a second later he hit the back of the pod hard as it shot out of the dreadnought. It wasn't a moment too soon, because 2 seconds later the burning wreck of the Conqueror slammed into the Deathbringer's belly. The dreadnought snapped in two before both capital ships were disappeared within a colossal explosion. The shockwave was enough to knock Grievous out and let him tumble through the escape pod as it raced towards the planet below.